Welcome back. It's been some time since I made a video, but I was discussing yesterday with Father Maximus about the definition of hypostasis because he was discussing it with some young men at the monastery. And then today is the Sunday of the Holy Fathers of the Fourth Ecumenical Council at Chalcedon, so I thought, why not make a video on the definition of hypostasis? So I have up here some citations from the Fathers, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. John of Damascus, and others, and I thought we would just read through them and discuss them. So the first. A hypostasis is a certain essence with properties, or a certain essence comprehensive of particulars, that is, of all properties in the concrete individual. I'm sure you've heard me say before that a hypostasis is a nature with properties. And here St. Maximus is saying exactly that. Let's go on, John of Damascus. For the more universal things are predicated of the particulars, yet they are not altogether the same, since the hypostasis is not the nature, as the hypostasis is not universal. However, the hypostasis receives the name and definition of the universal, although the converse is not true. For the hypostasis, that is, the individual of the nature, is the nature, but not only the nature, rather it is the nature with properties. But the nature is not a hypostasis, that is, not an individual. So here's a lot going on in this. So let's start from the top. The universal things are predicated of the particulars. That means that we predicate the nature to the hypostasis. So the hypostasis receives the name, right? It receives the name and definition of the universal. So a human hypostasis is so named because of the nature, which is human. A cat hypostasis is so named because of feline. A dog hypostasis is so named because of canine. Here we see that he says that the hypostasis is not the nature. This is true only because when the nature is considered as universal. However, the hypostasis is considered the nature when it is considered in the individual. Then it is the nature, as in, I am human. My hypostasis is the nature, in this case, human. There's no problem saying that. St. John of Damascus goes on, for a hypostasis is also nature, but the nature is no longer also hypostasis, for it is not reciprocal. For the universals are predicated of the particulars, but the particulars are not predicated of the universals. So again, we can say that a hypostasis is a nature, and we can predicate the hypostases of the natures, but we do not predicate natures of hypostases. This is not to confuse person and nature when we say that a hypostasis is a nature, because, again, a hypostasis is not only the nature, but a nature with properties. And the nature is not a hypostasis. So it is not a confusion of person and nature to say that a hypostasis is a nature, because a nature is not a hypostasis, and a hypostasis is not only a nature. Let's go on. This is the 6th session of the 7th Ecumenical Council. For the perversion of the truth by the Eutychians, that is, those who espouse one nature in the hypostatic union of Christ, and from this teach confusion, is nothing else except their defining hypostasis and nature to be the same, which we who are nurtured by the Catholic Church know to be distinct from each other. For we say hypostasis is a certain essence with properties. So here, even though, again, once we say that hypostasis is a nature, they are still distinct because the nature is not a hypostasis, and the hypostasis is not only nature, but nature with properties. Let's go on. St. Photius. For Christ will be said to have assumed a particular man if indeed he had assumed the nature with properties, which is nothing other than the hypostasis. The context of this statement from St. Photius is precisely what exactly did Christ assume in the Incarnation. What St. Photius is saying that Christ did not assume is a nature with properties. Why? Because a nature with properties is nothing other than a hypostasis. And as we know, in the Incarnation, Christ did not assume a second hypostasis. Rather, he only assumed a nature. Let's go on. St. Mark of Ephesus. For the hypostasis is nothing other than nature with properties. Hence, it is necessary that to be from the nature of a certain one or ones is also to be from the hypostasis or hypostases. There are two important things going on in this statement. First, we once again see, like St. Photius above, that the hypostasis is nothing other than nature with properties. There are some out there who claim that the definition of hypostasis being nature plus properties is inexhaustive, and that it doesn't cover the whole concept of what a hypostasis is. But for St. Mark, he definitely thinks that it is. For a hypostasis is nothing other. It is nothing other than nature with properties. The second sentence is just as important. Hence, it is necessary that to be from the nature of a certain one or ones is also to be from the hypostasis or hypostases. I am human by nature. Therefore, my hypostasis is human. Christ is also human by nature. He is also God by nature. Therefore, his hypostasis is both. There are a couple other things I want to discuss now that we've covered these in detail. One is that some say that hypostasis has no definition at all. They might say this because they think there's no consensus among the fathers, or they think that it is too difficult to define hypostasis, or they say that hypostasis transcends nature, or that it is unknown. This is not true. As seen by these citations, and there are more among the fathers, St. Eulogius of Alexandria, St. Philotheus Kokinos come off the top of my head as just two more. There certainly is a consensus among the fathers of what a hypostasis is. It is nature with properties. Others might say that a hypostasis is what it is regardless of the nature. This is rather confused because a hypostasis is a nature with properties. It is a nature. If you say that a hypostasis is what it is regardless of nature, you are no longer talking about a hypostasis. Why? Because a hypostasis is nature with properties. There is also the idea that there are distinctions among a hypostasis, such as personal, formal, and material. This goes to try to make a distinction between the stuff or the natures, the material that a hypostasis is made of or composed of, and the personal. This is rather confused because if you discuss a so-called personal hypostasis that is regardless of nature, you are no longer discussing a hypostasis at all. Why? Because a hypostasis is nature with properties. So you cannot discuss a hypostasis regardless of nature. You're no longer discussing a hypostasis. And again, we can predicate both universals of Christ's hypostasis. There are two natures, divine and human, and both can be predicated of his hypostasis. I would go so far as to say that those who say that we cannot predicate one or the other of his hypostasis are de facto denying that he is either one that they wish to not predicate of his hypostasis. If you say he is only divine, you are saying he is not human, because we can predicate both of his hypostasis. And John of Damascus has no problem doing so. Those who say that to say a hypostasis is a nature is a confusion of person and nature really need to negotiate what St. John is saying here when he says that a hypostasis is also a nature. When he says that when considered in the individual, the hypostasis is a nature. Again, the definition of hypostasis among the fathers is quite clear. It is nature with properties. I'm thinking of doing a short series on these kind of definitions, going into nature next, going into, and then accidents, maybe enhypostaton and anhypostaton. Give some real basic good groundwork. I hope that this has been edifying for you, and God bless.